The night has fallen, and the world outside has grown silent. This is the time for stories that can only be told in the dark. Welcome to the Dark Hour. I am Pan, your narrator. Ghostly horror. There are places on the map that are just names, but there are also places that are warnings. To Julian, the name Seabourn belonged to the latter. It didn't exist on travel routes and was mentioned only in old, musty books about coastal folklore, books that smelled of damp paper and sea salt. Julian was a folklorist, or, more poetically, a collector of forgotten stories. And Seabourn was one such story. A remote fishing town at the farthest edge of the coast, caught between the gray ocean on one side and ancient pine forests on the other. But Seabourn's specialty, the thing that made it famous in Julian's field, was the fog. A dense, wet fog, salty with the taste of the sea, that seemed never to lift, even on the hottest summer days. It wrapped around the town like a burial shroud. The only bus of the day dropped Julian off at a deserted harbor one twilight evening. The cold, damp air immediately seeped through his coat. The bus horn faded away, swallowed by silence and mist. Julian could hear only the sluggish rhythm of waves lapping against the anchored fishing boats and the creak of ropes shifting with the faint breeze. He stood there alone, feeling the town's unseen gaze fall upon him, though not a soul was in sight. Old wooden houses with roofs darkened by moss and moisture appeared faintly through the fog. Their windows looked like hollow, soulless eyes. There were no children laughing, no sound of televisions, only the silence of the sea. Julian's purpose here was clear: to learn about the silent night. Nearly a century ago, on a moonless night, Seabourn's lighthouse, the town's pride and guiding star, suddenly went dark. No explanation, no sign of malfunction. That same night, a ship called the Wanderer, carrying the town's fishermen, struck the reefs and vanished beneath the waves. No one survived. Since then, the lighthouse had never been lit again, and the people of Seabourn seemed to live under a curse of silence. Julian adjusted his backpack on his shoulder and began walking along the slippery cobblestone path. He needed to find the town's only inn. As he passed a few locals mending their nets, they merely glanced up at him with empty eyes, offered no greeting, and returned to their work. Their skin was roughened by the sea wind, and their faces bore an inherited sorrow, one passed down through generations. At last he found the inn called the Foghorn. The innkeeper was an old, thin man named Silas. He handed Julian a key without asking a single question about his purpose, as if the arrival of a stranger here was a nuisance too trivial to care about. Julian's room was on the second floor, overlooking the harbor. He opened the window, letting the salty air and mist flood in. From here, through the haze, he could see it, a faint silhouette, tall and solitary, standing on a distant cliff. The lighthouse. It loomed like a massive tombstone, silent and judging. Isolation and exhaustion from the long journey finally drew Julian toward the bed. He didn't bother closing the window. The chill air seemed heavy, and he sank into a deep sleep, a sleep far from peaceful. He didn't dream in fragments. Instead, it was as though his mind had been lifted out of his body. He felt himself drifting, gliding over Seabourn's mossy rooftops, through the thick mist like an invisible presence. He couldn't control his direction. Some unseen force was pulling him, not toward the lighthouse, but toward the ancient pine forests at the edge of town. His vision stopped at a decaying chapel, nearly swallowed by trees, but beneath it there was a stone door. one he knew no one could ever find without being guided. His being was swept forward, pulled through the fog, rushing toward that stone door. A chilling numbness seized him as his spirit was forced through solid rock, as if the moldy centuries within the stone were grinding him to dust. And then he was inside. Before him lay utter darkness. The air was thick, starved of oxygen, heavy with the scent of damp earth, ancient decay, and crystallized fear. A moment later, a torch flared in the distance, then another. Flickering lights slowly revealed a hellish sight. Below was a damp chamber lit by trembling flames. A group of figures in dark robes stood in a circle. At the center, Julian recognized the giant fisherman he had seen earlier, the one repairing nets when he arrived. They were performing a ritual. On a stone altar lay another man, bound tightly, his mouth gagged. One of the figures began chanting, Thane, Thane, and now Thane was muttering incantations in an ancient tongue, holding a knife carved from sharpened seashell. He didn't kill the man. Instead, he drew a shallow cut along his arm, letting the blood drip onto a spiral symbol carved into the altar. When the blood touched the symbol, the chamber trembled slightly. Julian heard a sound, not with his eyes, but within his mind. It was her melody, but here it was not mournful. It was powerful, hungry. Suddenly, Thane stopped. He raised his head, and somehow, impossibly, he looked straight at Julian's position. A knowing, wicked smile spread across his face, as though he was aware of the intruder among them. In an instant, Julian felt as if an invisible fist hurled him backward. He jolted upright in bed, screaming. His body was drenched in cold sweat. The room was the same. The chill air still poured in through the window. He was still in the foghorn. He tried to convince himself it had been just a nightmare, born of the eerie stories he had been reading. But when he pressed his hands to his face, he smelled it, clearly. The scent of stale air, damp earth, and fresh blood. The smell of the chamber from his dream. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. Not because of the waves, but because of another sound. A faint one, repeating softly, like the voice of a woman, humming a sorrowful, distant melody, hidden somewhere within the wind and the fog. Ghostly horror. The next morning, Julian woke up weary, his mind still haunted by the mournful tune from the night before. The fog outside his window seemed even thicker, turning the whole world into shades of ash gray. He decided the dusty books could wait. He needed to hear the story from those who had lived it. He asked the innkeeper, Silas, where the fishermen usually gathered. The old man merely muttered a name, the Sunken Anchor, and pointed toward the end of the road along the harbor. The tavern, the Sunken Anchor, lived up to its name. It sat tucked away in a shadowed corner, looking as though the sea could swallow it at any moment. Inside, the air was dim and heavy with the smell of damp wood, dried fish, and cheap beer. A few old men sat scattered around, silently drinking, staring at the bare walls. Julian's arrival made their already non-existent conversation fall into total silence. Every eye turned toward him, not curious, but coldly wary. Julian walked up to the bar, ordered a beer, and tried to strike up a conversation with the bartender. I'm a folklorist. I came here to study the town's history, particularly the event related to the lighthouse. Before he could finish, one of the old men in the corner spoke, his voice hoarse, like seashells scraping against rock. This place has no history, only waiting. Julian turned to look at him. The man had a white beard and a face creased deeply, like cracks on an old ship's hull. Waiting for what? Julian asked. The man didn't answer right away. He downed his drink, then looked Julian straight in the eyes.
"Boy, did you hear it last night? That singing voice." Julian froze. "Yes," he whispered, like a woman humming. A heavy silence fell over the tavern. The old man nodded slowly, a sad, bitter smile curling on his lips. "That's not the wind, boy. Here in Seabourn, we call it her melody. She sings for the dead and calls the names of those soon to die." "Who is she?" Julian asked, his voice trembling with both curiosity and fear. "No one knows," he replied. "Some say she's the ghost of a woman who lost her child to the sea. Others say she is the sea, mourning the souls it has devoured. But one thing's certain," he leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "The night the lighthouse went dark, the night the wanderer sank, her melody was heard clearer than ever, and it came from the lighthouse itself." He leaned back in his chair. "A word of advice, stranger. Keep your windows shut at night." He paused, then met Julian's eyes again, his tone suddenly sharp and cutting. "And never follow that song." His gaze was no longer distant. It was a direct warning, almost a threat. Before his expression softened back into weary detachment, Julian said nothing more. He drained his beer and stood up. As he turned to leave the tavern, he could feel every eye following him, especially the giant sitting in the corner, whose stare seemed to pierce right through his back. He stepped outside, the cold fog immediately enveloping him. He quickened his pace along the cobblestone street, trying to piece his thoughts together. Behind him, he heard the faint creak of the tavern door opening. He didn't look back, just walked faster. But then, he heard it. A new sound, mingling with his own footsteps. Thud, thud. A pair of heavy boots was following him. They weren't rushing, just keeping a steady distance. Always there, lingering at the edge of his hearing. He knew that even if he turned around, he'd see nothing but endless gray mist.
The faces in the old photograph. Julian took a deep breath, feeling the footsteps of the unseen followers still echoing in his mind. The old man's warning at the tavern hadn't been about a ghost. It was a law. And Julian knew that to survive, he needed to understand that law. He turned back toward the sunken anchor. When he stepped inside, the same hostile silence greeted him. The giant fisherman was still there in the corner, like a spider guarding its web. Julian ignored him and walked straight to the old man with the silver beard. "I understand," Julian said respectfully, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Stories like these usually begin with a real tragedy, and the tragedy of the Wanderer is an important part of this town's history." He skillfully steered the conversation towards something more specific, something harder to fabricate. "Can you tell me about it? About the ship, the people who were on it?" The tension in the tavern didn't fade, it only shifted. The fear of ghosts was replaced by the discomfort of an old wound being reopened by an outsider. The giant in the corner stopped polishing his dagger. The old man, let's call him Cormac, sighed, a sigh heavy with decades of memory. "The Wanderer," he murmured. "She was the biggest, sturdiest ship in Seabourn back then. Our pride." His voice sounded mechanical, like reciting something long rehearsed. Her captain was Thomas Croft, a seasoned seaman. Cormac paused, his gaze drifting to a dark wooden wall. Julian followed it and noticed an old black and white photograph hanging there. It showed a group of a dozen or so men standing on the ship's deck, smiling proudly. "That's them," another man nearby spoke up. "The entire crew of the Wanderer, taken right before the final voyage."
Julian stood up and stepped closer to examine the photo. But something caught his attention. At the edge of the picture, standing slightly apart from the group, was a man in a worn-out suit, holding a notebook. His face looked thoughtful, worried even. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing at the man in the suit. "He doesn't look like a fisherman." The tavern fell utterly silent. Cormac squinted, hesitation written all over his face. That's Mr. Finn, a man from the mainland. Said he was a marine researcher." "He was too curious for his own good," the hoarse voice of the giant interrupted, cutting across Cormac's words. He stepped out of the shadows, and now Julian saw his face clearly. Thane. He didn't respect the rules of the sea, and the sea always finds a way to cleanse itself. Thane's words weren't an explanation. They were a sentence and a direct warning to Julian. Cormac quickly spoke again, as if trying to ease the tension. Yes. Some said he brought bad luck. Landfolk don't belong to the sea, especially on a night like that." Julian ignored Thane, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He noticed another detail. One of the young sailors' faces had been deliberately scratched out, leaving a faint scar across the glass. And what about this one? The man whose face was scratched out. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Thane moved to stand directly behind Julian, his breath reeking of fish and cheap liquor. Cormac looked at Julian, not as a storyteller anymore, but as a man pleading for him to stop. "It's late, boy. You've asked too much already. Go."
Ghostly horror. The chase in the fog. Julian left the Sunken Anchor Tavern, his mind still haunted by the images of the dead men and Thane's unmistakable threat. Dusk had fallen, and the last light of day was quickly swallowed by a thick, encroaching fog. The few street lamps of Seabourn flickered on, not to illuminate, but to cast dim, trembling halos of amber that made the darkness and mist seem even more sinister. The air was colder, wetter than when he'd arrived. It slipped through his coat, brushing the back of his neck like an icy hand. Julian quickened his pace along the cobblestone street, his footsteps echoing eerily alone in the silence of the town. A strange unease crawled through him, a primal sense that he was being followed. He stopped and turned around. No one. Only the empty street and the hazy outlines of houses melting into the gray fog. He chuckled softly to himself, trying to shake it off. "I'm letting ghost stories and hostile stares get to me," he thought. "Just paranoia." But when he turned and took another step, he heard it. Thud. Another footstep, right after his. Too close, too clear. Julian froze, heart hammering in his chest. He held his breath and listened. Silence. A silence so dense it felt alive. He took a slow step. 1, 2. Thud. Thud. The sound came again, perfectly matching his rhythm, and this time when he glanced over his shoulder, he saw it. A tall figure, blurred by fog, standing still. The same presence that had followed him from the tavern. A chill ran down Julian's spine. He didn't dare turn again. His neck tingled, every instinct screaming that what was behind him wasn't a ghost, but something far more real. He began walking faster. The heavy footsteps behind him quickened too. He darted into a narrow alley, hoping to lose his pursuer, but a fishing cart had been dragged across the exit, blocking his way.
The whole town seemed to be conspiring against him. Panic surged. He turned and ran, his heart pounding like thunder, breath ragged and burning in the salty air. He passed house after house, but every door was bolted shut. Lights in the windows flicked off as he ran past, leaving him alone with the darkness and the hunter. Then, amid the pounding of his heart and the slap of his shoes, he heard it again. Her melody. It wasn't distant anymore. It was here, right beside him. A voice humming, soft, mournful, mocking. It was so clear, so close, as if the woman herself stood behind him, her icy breath brushing his neck. The cult and their demon were hunting him together. In a burst of blind terror, he spun around. No one. But for an instant, through the swirling fog, he swore he saw a shadow glide by. Tall, thin, wrapped in rags that fluttered like torn sails, and in its hand, a glint of metal, a fishhook. Was it the Lady of the Mist from the legend, or one of the men from the tavern? He no longer knew. Julian didn't wait to find out. He sprinted toward the dim golden light of the foghorn Inn. He burst through the door, slammed it shut, and threw the bolt. Leaning against the wooden frame, he gasped for breath, his whole body trembling. He thought he was safe, that he'd escaped. Then he turned toward his room and froze. On the fogged window pane, blurred by his own breath, someone had drawn a spiral from the inside. This wasn't a refuge. It was a cage, and they could come and go whenever they wanted.
Ghostly, horror, the Keeper's Masquerade. Julian stood in his inn room, the spiral on the window staring back at him like an eye, mocking his fear. The panic had faded, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He was the prey, yes, but prey didn't have to sit and wait to die. He needed answers, and he knew the only one who would speak to him was the innkeeper. He opened the door, its hinges groaning. As he descended the stairs, every sense was on high alert. The downstairs air still carried the warm scent of coal smoke, but the once peaceful scene now felt sinister. Silas sat in his old armchair by the fireplace, but he wasn't reading. He was carefully polishing a strange dagger, its hilt engraved with the spiral symbol. Hearing Julian's footsteps, Silas slowly placed the blade on the table, not the slightest hint of surprise in his face. "Something troubling you, boy?" His voice was calm, almost flat. "Stop pretending," Julian growled. "My room, the mark on the window, the people outside, and your cult. I know everything." Silas set the dagger down slowly. The sound of metal meeting wood echoed in the silence. His weariness vanished, replaced by a chilling composure. "You know nothing, young man," Silas said evenly. "You see fragments and build a monster out of them." "Then explain," Julian challenged. "Explain the rituals I've seen in my dreams." Silas sighed again, but not with sorrow. It was the sigh of a teacher humoring a foolish student. He motioned for Julian to sit. "This town is dying," Silas began, his voice now dripping with resigned, counterfeit sincerity. "The sea grows crueler. The fish vanish. The Lady of the Mist isn't just a legend. She hungers. She is a demon, and when she starves, she takes our children. What you've seen, those rituals, they're our desperate attempts to appease her. Old chants, small offerings. We do what we must to keep Seaborn alive." A beautifully crafted lie, Julian thought. He's turning killers into victims. "And Finn?" Julian pressed.
cutting straight to the point. "Ah, Finn," Silas murmured, shaking his head with a fleeting, sorrowful smile. "Like you, he was brilliant, but his intellect was a curse. He saw what we did and called it barbaric. He couldn't see that it was survival. He wanted to study the lady, to explain her with science. Do you understand? He tried to bottle a storm, to measure grief. That arrogance is what killed him." "He's warning me," Julian realized. "He's telling me that if I keep digging, I'll end up like Finn." "Finn didn't believe in our ways," Silas went on, staring into the fire. "He rejected the town's protection, thought his logic was enough. On the last night, he went to the lighthouse alone, refusing everything we gave him. He wanted to face her as a man of reason, and she welcomed him as prey." Silas's voice trembled at the end, a perfect act of remorse. The play was over, the warning delivered. Obey our rules or die like Finn. Julian decided to keep playing his part. "Then, what should I do?" he asked, feigning fear. "How do I stay safe?" Silas seemed satisfied. He rose and took a small carved wooden spiral from the mantelpiece. "You're not like Finn," Silas said, placing it in Julian's palm. "You know fear. Fear will save you. This is a charm. It won't drive her away, but it will tell her you respect our rules. Keep it with you." Julian held the charm. It was cold and slightly greasy to the touch. He looked into Silas's eyes, and in that instant, he saw the truth behind the mask, an abyss of cruelty. This wasn't protection. It was a mark, a collar for the lamb soon to be offered. "Thank you," Julian said, trembling for reasons Silas would never understand.
The Guide. Julian sat alone in his cold room, the door locked tight. Before him, on the old wooden table, lay Finn's notebook. It didn't look like a journal. It looked like something salvaged from a grave beneath the sea. The leather cover felt cold and faintly slimy, as if it still held traces of salt water. A faint scent rose from it, the smell of old paper, seaweed, and something else Julian couldn't name. The scent of pure terror. He knew this was part of the trap. Silas hadn't given it to him out of kindness, but for some darker purpose. Yet, he had no choice. This was the only trace of the man who'd walked this path before him. Taking a deep breath, Julian opened the notebook. The first pages were just as he expected, the handwriting of a scientist, neat, rational, full of scholarly curiosity. Finn noted wind speeds, tides, and reasonable hypotheses about the acoustic phenomena in Seabourn. But as he turned the pages, something changed. Finn's handwriting began to distort. It grew thinner, more crooked, as though written by a trembling hand. The scientific observations were interrupted by frantic questions and violent scratches of ink. And then it began. He reached a passage describing the first time Finn heard her melody at night. Quote, "It's unlike any natural sound, melodious yet wrong, like a lullaby that's been broken." End quote. As Julian read the line, a faint, low hum began to rise in his ears, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside the window, it was coming from the words themselves. He flipped the page in panic. Finn had written about the unnatural cold surrounding the lighthouse. Quote, "The temperature dropped suddenly, a cold that isn't real, a cold that lives in the bones." End quote. A wave of freezing air swept through the room. Julian shivered. He could see his breath drifting faintly in the lamplight. The room was turning to ice. Fear clawed at him, but a sick curiosity pushed him to keep reading. He turned to the final pages, where Finn's writing had devolved into desperate scratches. Julian found himself whispering the last line aloud. Quote, "It is not a ghost, it is a predator." End quote. The instant he spoke the final word, silence fell. The hum vanished, the cold receded, but in its place came something worse. Julian stared at the page. The ink of the last sentence began to run, spreading like someone had cried onto it. The paper rippled, darkened, until it became a pool of black liquid, swirling. He looked into it, and for a heartbeat of horror, he no longer saw the page. He saw a pair of eyes staring back from the abyss below, eyes full of ancient hunger. Julian screamed and hurled the notebook against the wall. He collapsed to the floor, gasping. His hands were empty, yet he could still feel the notebook, cold and slick, clinging to his skin. Then he understood. The journal wasn't a warning, it was a prophecy. It didn't recount Finn's past, it was writing Julian's future. And he realized in that moment of despair that he was reading the final chapters of his own life. Julian sat curled on the floor, the notebook lying a few feet away like a dead creature. Despair was a bottomless pit, and he was falling straight into it. He knew he couldn't stay and wait for death. But where could he go? What could he do? Every path led to the same end Finn had met. In panic, he lifted his head toward the window, not to look out, but simply to look into the void. The fog was endless, gray and suffocating. And then he saw it. Amid the fog by the docks below, a man stood motionless. Though blurred by mist, Julian recognized him instantly. The stance, the worn suit, the notebook in his hand. It was Finn. Julian rubbed his eyes, thinking he'd lost his mind, but the figure didn't vanish. Finn slowly raised his head and seemed to look straight at Julian's window. There was no face, no eyes, only emptiness, but Julian could feel the gaze. Then the figure turned and began walking slowly, deliberately, into a narrow alley between the houses. It was an unspoken invitation. A mad spark of hope flickered within Julian's despair. Escape or follow a ghost? Both were suicide, but only one offered a chance to see something new. He grabbed his coat and bolted from the room. He ran down the slick cobblestone streets, the icy fog whipping his face. The town was eerily still. When he reached the alley where the apparition had disappeared, he hesitated. But then, there it was again. The shadow of Finn, standing beneath a dim street lamp before turning and continuing onward. A ghostly chase began. Julian dared not get too close, following from afar. The shadow led him, not towards the lighthouse, but inland, away from the houses, towards the edge of an ancient pine forest. The path grew lonelier with every step. Finally, the figure stopped before a building almost consumed by nature, an old stone chapel overgrown with ivy and moss, its cross snapped in half. The place radiated neglect and sorrow. The shadow of Finn stood before the rotted wooden doors. It slowly lifted a translucent arm and pointed directly at them. Then it dissolved into the fog, as if it had never existed. Julian now stood alone before the abandoned chapel. The wind whistled through its cracks, whispering like voices. He was about to turn back, thinking this was another cruel trick of the entity. But then he heard it, a sound from within the chapel. Not her melody, but the low, rhythmic murmur of many voices chanting, a prayer repeated over and over in an ancient, guttural language. Finn's shadow hadn't led him into a trap. It had led him straight into the heart of the enemy.
The escort. The prison door creaked open. The flickering torchlight from outside cast long, distorted shadows. Thane and one of his henchmen stepped inside. They said nothing, silently cutting the rope that bound Julian's feet, then roughly hauled him up by the arms. Julian was almost out of strength. His body was exhausted after the psychological torture, and the echo of the screams still lingered in his mind. Yet in the midst of that exhaustion, his mind became strangely sharp. The image of the sacrificed woman, of the Lady of the Mist as a warden, had given him a truth to hold on to. He was no longer a confused prey. He was a witness. They dragged him away, his feet nearly sliding along the damp stone floor. The tunnel-like corridor was dark and narrow, the cold air thick with the scent of salt. From afar, the sound of chanting echoed, steady like the heartbeat of a giant beast. The path sloped downward, leading him deeper into the earth, away from the sound of the waves and closer to the source of the chanting. Julian tried to observe everything. The stone walls were covered with spiral symbols, more numerous and more complex than those he had seen in the town. Some of the symbols seemed to emit a faint, sickly greenish glow. He saw other alcoves carved into the rock, a few sealed with decayed wooden doors. Were those other cells? How many people had been brought down here? His mind screamed, trying to find an escape, a gap, a weapon. But all he had was the truth, the one they did not know he knew. Finally, they stopped before a large circular stone door, bigger than the others. The chanting here was muffled, almost inaudible. The place radiated a solemn, ancient silence. Thane tapped lightly on the door in a strange rhythm. The heavy stone door slid aside, revealing a room entirely different inside. Not a crude cave, but a study illuminated by candlelight. Thane did not step in. He simply shoved Julian inside. Then he and his henchmen stepped back, pulling the stone door shut with a thunderous boom. Julian fell flat on the floor. He had been separated from the guards, but he knew he had just been thrown into the den of the alpha wolf.
Facing the shepherd, Julian struggled to stand, his body aching, but his mind was operating at the highest level of alertness. He cast his gaze around the room. It was unlike any place he had ever seen. Bookshelves reached up to the ceiling of the cavern, filled with old leather-bound books. On a large table, ancient sea charts were spread out, but the coastlines and archipelagos upon them did not belong to any map he had ever known. The decorations were strange relics salvaged from the ocean floor. Seashells with grotesque spiral shapes, fragments of shipwrecked wood carved into the cult's symbols, and the incomplete skeleton of some marine creature unknown to science. And and in the center of the room, beside a small pool whose surface was black as tar, a man sat calmly on a stone chair, reading a book under candlelight. It was Malachi. He looked older than the surrounding cliffs themselves. His skin was pale, stretched tight in an unnatural sheen, and his pitch-black eyes lacked any whites. He lifted his head, closing the book without marking the page. Fame is a useful tool, but his methods lack refinement, Malachi said, his voice soft yet resonating with an ancient authority. Please, sit down, Julian. I believe you and I have much to discuss. Julian did not move. Who are you? He asked, his voice hoarse. Malachi stood. He was not as tall as Thane, but every motion he made exuded absolute control. I have many names. Those like Silas call me the gatekeeper. Thane calls me the leader. He stepped closer, his pitch-black eyes drilling into Julian's mind. But you, the one destined to inherit a great legacy, may call me the shepherd. Shepherd of what? Julian growled. A demon? Malachi laughed, a dry laugh like the rustle of autumn leaves. You are wiser than Finn. Finn only saw the monster. He could not see the beauty in our symbiosis. He stopped right before Julian. I do not often receive offerings. They are merely sustenance. But you are different. Malachi extended a long, thin, almost translucent finger toward Julian, but did not touch him. You are special, and someone special like you deserves to see your true heritage. He said no more, only gestured for Julian to approach the black pool. Julian hesitated, but there was a strange pull, a compulsion to know that drew his steps closer. Do not be afraid, Malachi whispered, his voice turning melodious and hypnotic. This is not water. This is memory, a window into truth. I will not explain. I will let you see. Malachi placed a thin, bony finger upon the surface of the pool. The black water did not ripple, but began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow. Let us begin with the song, Malachi said. On the surface, hazy smoke-like images began to take shape. Julian saw a woman with long black hair standing upon a cliff beneath a sunless sky. Her beauty was wild and full of vitality, but then the scene shifted. He saw her bound to a stone altar, the very place where Thane and the cult were preparing him. He saw Malachi's ancestors use a dagger made of shell to carve into her flesh. He could not hear her screams with his ears, but he felt them, like an earthquake within his mind. And when her blood ran down, merging with the spiral symbols, a mournful, endless note rang out. It was the first note of her melody. Not a song, but the sound of her soul being torn apart and bound. She was the lock, Malachi's voice echoed like that of a narrator. And we needed a tower to keep that lock from rusting. The surface of the pool changed again. Julian saw a fast-forwarded vision of the lighthouse being built, not by ordinary workers, but by robed figures moving within eternal mist. He saw faint, sickly strands of energy flowing from the rituals in the cairn, converging upon the lighthouse and plunging deep into the earth, reinforcing the invisible prison. It is a tool, and every tool must, eventually, be repaired. The final image appeared, and it was the most horrifying of all. Julian was seeing from beneath the water's surface. He saw the shadow of a ship, the Wanderer, gliding above. Then he saw the lighthouse on the cliff suddenly go dark. The ship lost its bearings, and in the illusion, he heard the triumphant roar of something deep below. He witnessed the ship crash upon the rocks, the sound of splintering wood mingling with desperate screams. And he saw glowing motes, souls, ripped from their drowning bodies, not ascending, but being pulled into an invisible maw beneath the sea. The ghostly images faded. The surface of the pool returned to its still black calm. Julian staggered back, his mind assaulted by what he had just witnessed. This was not like watching a film. He had been there. He had felt it all. "That is your legacy," Malachi said, his voice brimming with satisfaction. "The history of the throne you are to inherit. Power built upon suffering. A perfect balance."
The air. Julian staggered to his feet, his mind a chaos of screams from the past. "Why me?" he whispered, the question not meant for Malachi, but for the cruel fate itself. Malachi heard him. "Why?" he smiled, the smile of a collector who had just found a perfect specimen. "Because you were chosen, not by us, but by the abyss itself. Your dreams, your ability to connect with the dead, that is no coincidence. It is a gift, a natural resonance." He stepped closer, and for the first time, Julian saw a sick excitement gleaming in those pitch-black eyes. "The first warden, my ancestor, has grown weary after centuries. The prison is weakening. We need a new lock, a soul strong enough to bear this legacy. We have waited decades for someone like you to appear." "I will not kill you, Julian," Malachi said, his voice sweet in a grotesque way. "Death is a release. Your fate is far greater than that. We will separate your soul, cleanse it of unnecessary memories, and bind it to this prison. You will become immortal. You will be the next Lady of the Mist." The final truth struck Julian like a hammer blow. This was a death worse than death, an eternal exile. "You still do not believe?" Malachi clicked his tone. "Then let me show you your own future." He grabbed Julian by the hair again, but this time Julian no longer had the strength to resist. Malachi forced his head down into the black pool once more. "Behold your destiny, heir." Julian was pulled again into the infinite void, but this time he did not see dying galaxies. He saw himself. He saw himself standing upon the cliffs of Seabourn, but his body was translucent, hazy like mist. His eyes were empty, shining with a cold light. He opened his mouth, and instead of words, a mournful, powerful melody poured out, the song of the warden. The scenery around him changed at blinding speed. He saw ships passing by, generations of townsfolk being born and dying, the houses of the town rotting and collapsing. Centuries passed in the blink of an eye, yet he still stood there, unchanged, forever bound to the cliff, forever singing the song that imprisoned the monster below, while another part of himself screamed in silent agony. He had seen eternity, and it was a horror without end. Malachi pulled him up. Julian no longer screamed. He was completely broken, his eyes hollow. Every last spark of hope had been extinguished. "The legacy has been passed, the prophecy fulfilled," Malachi declared, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Now let the ceremony begin." The heir. Julian staggered to his feet, his mind a chaos of screams from the past. "Why me?" he whispered, the question not meant for Malachi,
but for the cruel fate itself. Malachi heard him. Why? He smiled, the smile of a collector who had just found a perfect specimen. Because you were chosen, not by us, but by the abyss itself. Your dreams, your ability to connect with the dead, that is no coincidence. It is a gift, a natural resonance. He stepped closer, and for the first time, Julian saw a sick excitement gleaming in those pitch-black eyes. The first warden, my ancestor, has grown weary after centuries. The prison is weakening. We need a new lock, a soul strong enough to bear this legacy. We have waited decades for someone like you to appear. I will not kill you, Julian, Malachi said, his voice sweet in a grotesque way. Death is a release. Your fate is far greater than that. We will separate your soul, cleanse it of unnecessary memories, and bind it to this prison. You will become immortal. You will be the next Lady of the Mist. The final truth struck Julian like a hammer blow. This was a death worse than death, an eternal exile. You still do not believe, Malachi clicked his tongue. Then, let me show you your own future. He grabbed Julian by the hair again, but this time Julian no longer had the strength to resist. Malachi forced his head down into the black pool once more. Behold your destiny, heir. Julian was pulled again into the infinite void, but this time he did not see dying galaxies. He saw himself. He saw himself standing upon the cliffs of Seabourn, but his body was translucent, hazy like mist. His eyes were empty, shining with a cold light. He opened his mouth, and instead of words, a mournful, powerful melody poured out, the song of the warden. The scenery around him changed at blinding speed. He saw ships passing by, generations of townsfolk being born and dying, the houses of the town rotting and collapsing. Centuries passed in the blink of an eye, yet he still stood there, unchanged, forever bound to the cliff, forever singing the song that imprisoned the monster below, while another part of himself screamed in silent agony. He had seen eternity, and it was a horror without end. Malachi pulled him up. Julian no longer screamed. He was completely broken, his eyes hollow. Every last spark of hope had been extinguished. The legacy has been passed. The prophecy fulfilled, Malachi declared, his voice filled with satisfaction. Now let the ceremony begin. He turned toward the stone door and commanded, Thane, bring our heir to the altar.
The road to the guillotine. The heavy stone door slid open. Thane stepped inside. But this time, Julian no longer saw him as a terrifying monster. He only saw a servant, a blind devotee. The truth Malachi had revealed hadn't driven Julian mad. It had done something far worse. It had extinguished every emotion within him. Hope, fear, anger, all had been burned away by the vision of a horrifying eternity. Now only emptiness remained, cold and hollow. He was a walking corpse, a man who had already died before the execution. They no longer needed to drag him along. He walked on his own, between Thane and another acolyte. He moved through the cavern halls without looking around. He no longer sought an escape. He was walking down the road to his own tomb. The chanting grew louder, but now, in Julian's ears, it no longer sounded dreadful. He heard the yearning within it, the desperation of finite beings trying to cling to existence by offering up the souls of others. He found them not frightening, but pitiful. He could feel it beneath him, the abyss, a heavy presence, a pressure pressing down on his chest, a silent hunger awaiting its meal. At last, they arrived before the mouth of a great cavern. The cold wind from the sea and the heat from dozens of torches within surged out together, mingling with the roar of the waves and the chanting of the cult. It struck him like a wall of sound and energy. Thane shoved Julian forward into the chamber. The entire cult was there, standing in a silent circle around a stone altar at the center. Torchlight danced upon their lifeless faces, and standing upon the altar, beside Malachi, was Silas, holding a dagger with a spiral-shaped hilt. Every eye turned toward Julian, not with the gaze of predators, but with the gaze of lambs, looking upon the sacrifice that would bring them salvation.
The offering on the stone altar. Thane pushed Julian forward. He staggered along the path formed by 2 rows of silent worshippers. He could feel their eyes on him, not filled with hatred, but with a fanatical hunger. He was the lamb about to be sacrificed to ensure the pack of wolves could continue to exist. They threw him onto the altar. The stone was icy cold, rough, and the grooves of the massive spiral symbol carved into it pressed hard against his back. Lying on his back, he could only look up through the hole in the ceiling. A gray, ashen sky without a single star. That was his final glimpse of the world. Malachi stood at the head of the altar, gazing down at him with scholarly fascination. Silas stood at the foot, holding the dagger, forged from the iron of the sunken ship, in both hands with solemn reverence. Thane stood beside them, towering like a sentry, ensuring the sacrifice had no chance to escape. Silence blanketed the cavern, broken only by the distant growl of the sea outside. Then, Malachi began to speak. His voice no longer sounded like that of an old man. It became resonant, ancient, commanding. He wasn't chanting. He was giving orders. He spoke in a language Julian had never heard, yet somehow Julian understood its meaning. "O weary warden, hear me. Your hour of release has come." A freezing wind howled through the cave, making the torches flicker violently. Within the wind, Julian could hear her song, but this time it wasn't mournful. It was filled with terror and defiance. "O slumbering abyss, awaken. Your feast is prepared." The ground beneath Julian trembled. He could feel the terrible pressure rising from below, an endless hunger being stirred awake. The roar of the sea outside grew mad, as if the entire ocean was trying to smash through the cliffs and pour in. Julian lay there, utterly powerless. He no longer felt fear, only emptiness. He thought of his life, the books, the travels, the stories he had collected. All of it was about to end here on a cold slab of stone, as the key sealing a prison of nightmares. Malachi raised both hands toward the ceiling, his voice reaching its peak. "Offer the new soul. Let the transfer begin." He gestured. Silas stepped forward, lifting the dagger high. The blade, made of corroded iron, tempered by the souls of dozens of the dead, gleamed with a sickly red hue in the torchlight. He placed the tip against Julian's chest. The ritual had reached its final act. The blade was about to fall.
The symphony. The rusted iron blade began to descend, millimeter by millimeter. In the silence, Julian could hear the wind whistling through the hole in the cavern ceiling. Malachi smiled, ready to witness the culmination of his life's work. Silas, eyes blazing with fanatic devotion, shifted his weight.
preparing for the final plunge. The emptiness within Julian's mind was a perfect void. But nature does not allow emptiness. And when the soul of the Lady of the Mist, the first warden, realized she was about to gain a companion in her exile, she refused. A single note rang out. It was not a scream. It was a low, solitary, mournful tone. It was her song. But it was no longer distant, echoing from the harbor. It was here, now, reverberating inside the cavern itself. Malachi froze. His smile stiffened. What? That note was a signal. Instantly, another voice joined in, a deep male voice, full of rage and the sound of crashing waves. It was the song of the fishermen aboard the Wanderer. Then hundreds more joined, shrill, piercing screams of the victims from the chapel, the groans of souls trapped within mummified corpses, the sobs of Finn. Every soul Julian had connected with, every agony he had been forced to witness, was no longer a passive memory. They had found a vessel, a speaker, a champion. They were singing through him. The song changed. It was no longer a melody. It became a symphony of wrath. The verses were no longer humming tones, but accusations. Betrayal, deception, murder. The air within the cavern vibrated violently. The torch flames turned from orange to a ghostly phosphorescent blue, the color of souls. The spiral symbols on the walls began to bleed. Malachi stumbled back in terror. No, be silent! Silence them! He barked the order at Silas. Kill him! Kill him now! Silas, face pale as death, tried to obey. He braced himself, summoning every ounce of strength to drive the dagger down. But it was too late. The dagger, forged from the iron of the sunken ship, was metal tempered by the very souls now singing. It was part of them. As the symphony of wrath reached its crescendo, the dagger in Silas's hand began to tremble. At first, a faint vibration, then violently, uncontrollably. A burning red light, like molten embers, spread from the rusted cracks. It's burning, Silas screamed, trying to let go, but the dagger seemed fused to his flesh. Then with one final scream from the chorus of souls, the dagger exploded. Not shattered, exploded into thousands of molten fragments. Silas shrieked in agony, his face and chest shredded by the blast. He toppled backward off the altar, dead before he hit the ground. The shockwave of that spiritual explosion rippled outward. The entire cult collapsed. They weren't struck physically, they were assaulted by their own sins. Their minds were invaded by the memories of those they had sacrificed. They fell to their knees, screaming, clawing at their faces, drowning in madness of their own making. Thane roared like a wounded beast, clutching his head as blood streamed from his nose and ears. Malachi was hurled backward, slamming into the cavern wall. He slid down, coughing blood, glaring at Julian in disbelief. "What have you done?" he hissed. "You're not the heir. You're a gate. You've broken the ritual." He was right. The interference had shattered the balance. The Lady of the Mist had abandoned her post as warden to join the vengeance. And below them, the abyss, promised a feast but given nothing, had been awakened. The prison was gone. The warden had left. It was angry. The entire cavern began to quake violently, not from the singing, but from something below them trying to rise.
The abyss. The ground split open. A cold, black wind erupted from below, carrying with it the stench of decay and salt. The torches were instantly snuffed out, leaving only the eerie blue glow from the bleeding symbols. Malachi staggered to his feet, his white robes soaked crimson. He spread his arms wide, face twisted in both ecstasy and horror. "It's awake! The depth! It's awake!" Julian could barely hear him. The song had stopped, leaving only the vast, suffocating silence. A silence so heavy that even his heartbeat seemed muted. Then came the sound. Not a roar, not a scream, something worse, like the groaning of the earth itself, as if the ocean floor were cracking open. It was deep, ancient, and alive. The altar cracked in two, sending Julian's body sliding toward the abyssal fissure. He clawed at the stone, fingernails breaking, blood smearing across the runes. Malachi lunged forward, grasping Julian's wrist. For a moment, their eyes met, the dying prophet and the broken heir. "You don't understand," Malachi rasped, his face ghostly pale. "It wanted this. It wants you." Then the floor beneath him gave way. Malachi was swallowed whole by the darkness, his scream vanishing into the void. Julian's grip failed. The world tilted and he fell, downward, into the lightless chasm. He didn't feel the fall. There was no sense of motion, no rush of air, only the sensation of sinking, as though the darkness were not empty space, but a dense, living fluid, drawing him deeper. He tried to move, but his body was no longer his own. His limbs floated weightlessly, drifting like those of a drowned man. All around him, faint lights began to appear. Blue, green, white, thousands of them, like stars beneath the sea. And in each, he saw faces, the souls of the drowned, the lost, the forgotten. Their mouths moved, whispering without sound. Their eyes, hollow, endless, were fixed on him. Then from the deepest dark, something stirred. It was vast, impossibly vast. Its shape could not be described, only felt, like the shadow of a leviathan moving beneath an ocean trench. Its presence alone warped thought, memory, and time. Julian's mind screamed, but his mouth could not. His sanity frayed like old rope under strain. Then in the midst of that terror came a voice. Soft, familiar, female. Julian. His breath caught. It was her, the Lady of the Mist. Her form appeared faintly before him, woven from the light of the souls. "You shouldn't have come here. I didn't choose to..." He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. She drifted closer, her eyes sad. "I know, but choices don't matter here. Not anymore." Her hand reached out, touching his chest. A faint glow bloomed beneath her fingers, the symbol that had marked him since the ritual began. "You carry the echo now. You've opened the path." What path? He thought. The words meant nothing here. The path between the living and the drowned. The glow spread, radiating outward. The faces around him began to fade, drawn toward the light. The colossal shadow below stirred again, restless, hungry. "Go back, before it takes notice of you completely." He tried to protest, but the darkness surged upward like a tidal wave. The lady's form dissolved, her voice echoing one last time. "Wake up." Then came the pain. A flash of light, a gasp of air, and Julian was back, lying on the wet stones of the ruined cavern. The fires had died, the cult was gone, only ashes remained. The dagger, or what was left of it, lay beside him, half melted, still faintly glowing red. He sat up slowly, trembling, eyes wide. Above him, through the crack in the cavern roof, he could see the dawn sky breaking, gray,
pale, silent. The nightmare was over. Or perhaps it had only just begun.
The awakening. Julian awoke to the sound of rain. It wasn't the cavern anymore. It was open air. He was lying on the rocky shoreline, the tide washing over his legs. The sea was calm, impossibly calm, as if the storm that had torn through the night had never existed. He sat up slowly, coughing seawater. Every muscle screamed. His head pounded with the echo of countless voices, now reduced to faint murmurs at the edge of thought. The village above the cliffs was silent. The chapel, once ablaze, was now nothing but a skeleton of charred stone. He staggered to his feet, clutching his chest where the symbol still burned faintly under his skin. When he looked down, he saw it. The faint shimmer of light pulsing like a heartbeat. "Still there," he whispered, voice hoarse. Then came the whisper, soft, from within his mind. "Julian?" He froze. It wasn't the lady. This voice was younger, trembling. "Finn?" he breathed. The whisper came again, stronger now, desperate. "Don't let it take me, please." Julian's eyes widened. He turned toward the sea, scanning the horizon. There was nothing, only mist rolling over the waves. But then he saw it. A flicker of blue light beneath the surface, faint, flickering like a lantern swaying in the depths. It moved closer. He stumbled backward, heart racing. The water rippled. A pale hand, small, fragile, broke the surface, reaching upward. "Finn!" he shouted, falling to his knees at the edge. Without thinking, he plunged his arm into the freezing water. His fingers brushed against something solid, skin, cold as marble. He pulled with all his strength. For a brief, impossible moment, he saw a face rise through the water. Finn's, eyes wide, lips moving soundlessly. Then the sea swallowed him whole once more, vanishing into silence. Julian collapsed, gasping, his arm trembling violently. "No, no, please." The echo of the lady's words returned to him, soft but inescapable. The path between the living and the drowned. He fell to his knees, the realization striking him like a blade. He hadn't closed the gate, he had become it. Behind him, thunder rolled across the gray horizon. The tide began to rise again, slowly, purposefully, as if the sea itself were breathing. Julian turned his gaze toward the horizon, and for an instant, he thought he saw something vast moving beneath the waves. Not a shadow this time, but an eye, immense and aware, opening beneath the surface. He didn't move. He couldn't. The faint blue mark on his chest pulsed once, twice, then went still. The whisper returned, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "We're still waiting, Julian." And as the tide reached his knees, he finally understood. The song was not over. It had only changed its singer.
Tonight's tale has drawn to a close, but do not mistake it for mere fiction. Our world has countless shadowed corners, and the most terrifying stories are always the ones that are true. Thank you for listening. We will return to the darkness soon enough.